I never thought my own baby shower would become the battlefield where my future mother-in-law would launch her final attack to destroy my engagement. Standing in that community center, surrounded by opened gifts and scattered cake, watching Linda Thompson's satisfied smirk as she delivered her devastating announcement to my guests, I realized this wasn't just about stopping a wedding. This was about erasing me completely from her son's life. What she didn't expect was that her cruelty would become the catalyst that transformed me from a naive young woman trying desperately to please everyone into someone who would build an empire she could never touch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Martinez, and at 26, I thought I had my life perfectly mapped out. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized agency in downtown Atlanta, where I'd landed my first real job after college. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly coordinating campaigns for local businesses and managing social media accounts, but it paid the bills and gave me enough flexibility to dream about bigger things. I lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment in Virginia Highland, the kind of place where I could walk to coffee shops and farmers markets on weekend mornings. Ryan Thompson had been my everything for 2 years. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party, where he charmed me with his easy laugh and genuine interest in my stories about disastrous client presentations. He worked in construction management, following in his father's footsteps, and had this wonderful way of listening that made me feel like the most fascinating person in the room. Ryan was steady and reliable, the kind of man who brought me soup when I was sick and remembered important meetings I had at work. Our relationship moved at a comfortable pace. Weekend trips to Savannah, dinner dates at little Ethiopian restaurants we'd discovered together, lazy Sunday mornings where we'd read different sections of the newspaper and share interesting articles. When he proposed on New Year's Eve at Piedmont Park, with the Atlanta skyline glittering behind us, I thought I was living in a fairy tale. The ring was simple but beautiful, and more importantly, it represented a future I desperately wanted. That should have been my first warning about Linda Thompson. While Ryan's father Tom had embraced me immediately, calling me the daughter he never had and praising my marketing skills whenever I helped promote his construction business's community events, Linda remained politely distant. She was a former real estate agent who now devoted her time to various charity boards and maintaining their pristine suburban home in Buckhead. Every interaction felt like an audition I was somehow failing. During our engagement dinner at their country club, Linda had made several comments that I'd tried to brush off as harmless. She mentioned how young we both were, how Ryan had such promising career prospects that required focus, how marriage was such a big step that some people rushed into without proper consideration. When I'd laughed and said we'd been together 2 years and felt ready, she'd smiled that tight smile I would come to know so well and said timing was everything in life. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwelcome either. Ryan and I had talked about wanting children someday, and when I missed my period and the little pink line appeared on the test, we felt ready to embrace this new chapter. We were engaged, financially stable enough, and deeply in love. Ryan's reaction when I told him was everything I could have hoped for. He lifted me up and spun me around our tiny kitchen, already talking about converting the spare bedroom and researching the best pediatricians in Atlanta. His parents' reactions couldn't have been more different. Tom was overjoyed, immediately talking about teaching his future grandchild to use tools and planning fishing trips for years down the road. Linda's congratulations felt forced, accompanied by comments about how challenging it would be to plan a wedding while pregnant, how expensive babies were, and how young parenthood would limit our options in life. This subtle undermining began almost immediately. Linda would call Ryan at odd hours, claiming emergencies that required his immediate attention but somehow resolved themselves by the time he arrived. She started inviting him to family events with very specific time slots that happened to conflict with plans we'd already made. When I'd mentioned feeling left out, Ryan would promise to talk to her, but somehow these conversations never seemed to change anything. Planning the baby shower had been my sister Sophia's idea. She lived in Miami but insisted on flying up to help organize everything, wanting to celebrate her first niece or nephew in style. We'd rented the community center in Ryan's neighborhood, thinking it would be convenient for his family and co-workers to attend. The guest list included my closest friends from work, college friends who were scattered across the Southeast, Ryan's sister who was driving down from Charlotte, and of course, both our mothers. Linda had seemed surprisingly enthusiastic about the shower, offering to help with decorations and suggesting we include some traditional games she remembered from her own shower decades earlier. I was thrilled that she wanted to be involved, hoping this might be the bonding experience that would finally bring us closer together. She volunteered to handle the cake order from the bakery she'd used for various charity events, insisting she had connections that would get us a better deal. The morning of the shower arrived with typical Georgia humidity that made my hair curl in ways I couldn't control. Despite an hour with a straightening iron, Sophia had arrived 2 days earlier and had transformed the community center into something magical, with soft yellow and green decorations, since Ryan and I had decided to wait until birth to learn the baby's gender. Balloons clustered in corners, a beautiful gift table draped with a handmade tablecloth Sophia had brought from Miami, and centerpieces featuring baby's breath and small succulents that guests could take home. My work friends arrived first, their arms full of beautifully wrapped presents, and their excitement infectious. Ashley Chen, my closest friend from the office, had driven straight from a client meeting and was still wearing her business suit but had changed into party-appropriate shoes in the parking lot. We'd been friends since my first day at Henderson & Associates when she'd rescued me from a malfunctioning printer and introduced me to the best lunch spots downtown. The games began smoothly with everyone guessing the baby's due date and writing down parenting advice for a time capsule we planned to open when the child turned 18. My college roommate had organized a hilarious guessing game involving baby food flavors that had everyone laughing and sharing horror stories about their own children's eating habits. The energy in the room was warm and celebratory, exactly what I'd hoped for. Ryan's sister Jennifer arrived with her 2 young children in tow, apologizing for being late due to traffic on Interstate 85. She brought a beautiful handmade quilt that had been in their family for generations, something Ryan's grandmother had started but never finished. Jennifer had spent months completing it specifically for our baby, and the gesture moved me to tears. This was the kind of family connection I'd always hoped to find with the Thompsons. Linda arrived precisely on time with the cake, which looked absolutely stunning. It was a 3-tier creation with delicate sugar flowers and "Welcome Baby Thompson" written in elegant script across the top. She'd coordinated with the decorations perfectly, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her thoughtfulness. Maybe I'd been overthinking her previous coolness. Maybe this pregnancy was bringing us together in ways I hadn't expected. The gift. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Opening proceeded with the usual mixture of practical items and adorable tiny clothes that made everyone coo appreciatively. I received everything from a top-of-the-line stroller system to the softest blankets I'd ever felt. Ryan's co-workers had gone in together on a beautiful crib that matched the changing table Sophia and I had already purchased. Each present felt like a vote of confidence in our growing family. It was Linda who suggested we cut the cake before opening the final few gifts, claiming she needed to leave soon for another commitment. I appreciated her thinking ahead, since I was getting tired and several guests had mentioned needing to head out by a certain time. The cake cutting felt ceremonial, another milestone in this celebration of our growing family. Linda insisted on making a speech before we served the cake, which seemed natural since she was Ryan's mother and had provided this beautiful centerpiece for our celebration. She stood at the front of the room, wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit that looked like it came straight from a country club luncheon, and smiled at our assembled guests. Her words started conventionally enough, thanking everyone for celebrating this special time with Emma and Ryan, expressing how much family meant to the Thompson clan, and acknowledging what an important milestone this represented. The guests listened politely, some already reaching for their phones to capture the moment. Then her tone shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught it immediately. There was something calculated in the way she paused, the way her smile became more fixed, the way her eyes found mine across the room with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Ladies and gentlemen," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the community center, "while we're all here celebrating, I think it's important that we're honest about the situation we're really facing." She gestured toward me with what looked like maternal concern but felt like something else entirely. "Emma is a lovely girl, and I'm sure she'll be a devoted mother, but I've been doing some thinking about what's best for everyone involved, especially my son." The room had gone quiet in that particular way that signals everyone senses something uncomfortable is about to happen, but no one knows quite what. "Ryan isn't ready for this level of responsibility," Linda announced with the confidence of someone delivering medical diagnosis. "He's 27 years old, just getting established in his career, and frankly, I'm not sure this relationship is built on the kind of foundation that survives the stress of parenthood." The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel my face burning as 35 guests turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from shocked to uncomfortable to deeply sympathetic. Ashley had gone completely still beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing tightly. Linda wasn't finished. She continued with the same reasonable tone she might use to discuss weather patterns or restaurant recommendations. "I've seen too many young couples think that a baby will solve their relationship problems or force a commitment that isn't organic. The statistics on young marriages are quite sobering, and adding an unplanned pregnancy to that dynamic rarely improves the odds." Sophia stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor, her face flushed with anger, but Linda simply smiled at her and continued speaking. "I want what's best for both Emma and Ryan, which is why I think they should seriously consider whether moving forward with this wedding is the right choice for anyone involved, including this innocent baby." The community center felt like a vacuum, where sound couldn't travel properly. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears and the distant hum of the air conditioning system, but everything else seemed muffled by the enormity of what had just happened. My future mother-in-law had just suggested, in front of everyone I cared about, that I was trapping her son with an unwanted pregnancy, and that our relationship wasn't strong enough to survive parenthood. Jennifer looked mortified, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at her mother in disbelief. Several of my work friends were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shock and disapproval. The children in the room seemed to sense the tension and had gone unusually quiet. But Linda wasn't done delivering her devastating assessment of my worthiness as a future daughter-in-law. She had more observations to share about the challenges facing couples who rush into marriage due to unexpected circumstances, the importance of being realistic about compatibility, and her sincere hope that everyone would support Ryan and me in making the most mature decision possible for all involved. As she spoke, I realized this wasn't a spontaneous outburst triggered by maternal concern. This was a calculated attack designed to humiliate me so thoroughly in front of our friends and family that I would have no choice but to retreat from Ryan's life entirely. She had planned this moment, chosen this venue where I couldn't escape or respond privately, and delivered her message with surgical precision. The cake sat untouched, on its beautiful stand, the sugar flowers now looking somehow mocking rather than celebratory. The gifts piled around me represented dozens of people who believed in our future, who had invested time and money in celebrating our growing family, who were now witnessing the most humiliating moment of my life. I wanted to respond, to defend our relationship and challenge her assumptions, but my throat felt completely closed. No words seemed adequate to address what had just happened. How do you argue with someone who has just questioned your worth as a human being in front of everyone you love? Linda concluded her speech by suggesting we all continue enjoying the party and not let difficult conversations ruin what should be a joyful day. She served herself a piece of cake as if nothing unusual had occurred, making small talk with the guests closest to her about how lovely the decorations looked. The rest of the shower passed in a blur of forced normalcy that felt surreal. People ate cake and made polite conversation, but the energy had been completely drained from the room. Several guests made excuses to leave early, offering hurried hugs and whispered assurances that everything would work out fine. The gift opening concluded with everyone trying too hard to maintain enthusiasm for baby blankets and bottles while carefully avoiding eye contact with Linda. Ashley stayed until the very end, helping Sophia and me pack up decorations and load gifts into my car. We worked mostly in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. When Linda finally left, offering a cheerful goodbye and thanking us for a lovely party, Ashley finally spoke. "What the hell was that about?" she asked quietly, folding chairs with more force than necessary. "I've never seen anything like it. Who says something like that at a baby shower?" I couldn't answer because I was still trying to process it myself. The woman who would soon be my mother-in-law had essentially announced to our entire social circle that she didn't believe in our relationship, didn't think Ryan was ready for fatherhood, and questioned whether our marriage should proceed. She had done it publicly, deliberately, and with enough plausible deniability that she could claim she was just being honest about her concerns if anyone confronted her about it later. Sophia was furious in the way only protective sisters can be, pacing around the community center and muttering in Spanish about people who smile while wielding knives. She wanted to call Ryan immediately and demand he address his mother's behavior, but I asked her to wait. I needed time to figure out how to even begin explaining what had happened. The drive home felt endless despite being only 15 minutes through familiar Atlanta neighborhoods. Every traffic light gave me more time to replay Linda's words, to remember the faces of my guests as they witnessed my humiliation, to wonder how many people would leave that shower questioning whether Ryan and I really belonged together. My apartment felt different when I walked in, like it belonged to someone else or existed in a different timeline where baby showers ended with joy instead of devastation. The nursery furniture we'd started assembling sat half-finished in the spare bedroom, suddenly looking naive and presumptuous instead of hopeful and exciting. I sat on my couch surrounded by bags of gifts from people who loved me, holding the family quilt Jennifer had finished for our baby, and tried to understand what Linda's ultimate goal had been. Did she want to break up our engagement entirely? Was she hoping to delay the wedding until after the baby was born? Was she simply establishing her dominance in whatever family dynamic would emerge from this pregnancy? When Ryan called an hour later, his voice was tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Mom told me there was some kind of misunderstanding at the shower," he said without any preamble. "She said things got a little awkward, and she's worried you might have taken something the wrong way." The phrase, "taken something the wrong way," hit me like a physical blow. In less than 2 hours, Linda had managed to reframe her calculated attack on our relationship as a misunderstanding caused by my oversensitivity. She had positioned herself as the concerned mother worried about hurt feelings, rather than the woman who had deliberately humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. I tried to explain what had actually happened, to convey the deliberate cruelty of her speech and the devastating impact it had on our guests, but Ryan seemed to have already accepted his mother's version of events. He kept saying things like, "I'm sure she didn't mean it that way," and "she's just worried about us taking on too much too fast, and maybe we can all sit down and talk through any concerns." The conversation that should have been Ryan defending our relationship and demanding his mother apologize instead became me trying to convince my fiancé that his mother had intentionally humiliated me. When I described the specifics of what Linda had said, Ryan's responses suggested he thought I was exaggerating or misinterpreting her intentions. By the time we hung up, I felt more alone than I had before calling him. The person who should have been my strongest advocate was instead suggesting that maybe his mother had valid points about our readiness for marriage and parenthood. He didn't seem to understand that this wasn't about whether we faced legitimate challenges as young parents, but about Linda deliberately sabotaging our baby shower to undermine our relationship. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how my celebration had turned into my humiliation. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Linda's satisfied expression as she delivered her devastating speech, the uncomfortable faces of my friends as they realized what was happening, the way the joy had drained out of the room like air from a punctured balloon. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that was certainly painful enough. The worst part was the growing realization that this was just the beginning. If Linda was willing to sabotage my baby shower to challenge our relationship, what would she do when the baby was actually born? What kind of grandmother would she be to a child she clearly didn't want to exist? What kind of future mother-in-law would she be to someone she'd publicly questioned and humiliated? I thought about calling Sophia or Ashley, but what could they say that would change anything? They'd witnessed what happened and were appropriately outraged on my behalf, but that didn't solve the fundamental problem. I was pregnant with the child of a man whose mother saw me as unsuitable for her family, and that man seemed more interested in maintaining peace than defending my dignity. The next morning brought a text from Linda that was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. She hoped I was feeling better after yesterday's emotional afternoon, understood that pregnancy hormones could make everything feel more intense than intended, and suggested we have lunch soon to clear the air about any miscommunications. The message made my skin crawl with its implied narrative that my reaction to her behavior was the real problem, not the behavior itself. She had reduced my legitimate anger about being publicly humiliated to pregnancy hormones and emotional instability. Once again, she had positioned herself as the reasonable adult dealing with an oversensitive young woman who couldn't handle honest conversation. Ryan's response when I showed him the text was to suggest that maybe lunch with his mother was a good idea, that talking things through could help us all understand each other better. He seemed genuinely unable to see the manipulation in Linda's message or understand why I found her offer insulting rather than conciliatory. That was the moment I realized that this situation was bigger than a difficult mother-in-law or a humiliating party. This was about fundamental differences in how Ryan and I understood respect, family dynamics, and what kind of support we could expect from each other during difficult times. If he couldn't recognize what his mother had done or why it was unacceptable, how could I trust him to protect our family from future attacks? The pregnancy that had once felt like a joyful surprise now felt like a trap that connected me permanently to people who didn't want me and their family. Every doctor's appointment, every milestone, every decision about our child would potentially become another battlefield where I had to fight for basic respect and consideration. I started noticing other things I'd previously overlooked or excused, the way Linda always seated me at the opposite end of the table from Ryan during family dinners. How she consistently forgot to include me in group photos until someone else pointed out my absence. The way she asked about my work with polite disinterest while enthusiastically discussing Ryan's career prospects and professional achievements. The pattern had been there all along, but I'd been so eager to be accepted that I'd minimized clear signs of rejection and hostility. Linda had never intended to welcome me into their family. The baby shower attack wasn't an aberration, it was simply the moment she stopped pretending to tolerate me and decided to actively work toward my removal from Ryan's life. 3 days after the shower, I was still struggling to eat or sleep properly. The stress was affecting my pregnancy in ways that worried me, and I found myself unable to concentrate at work or engage normally with friends who called to check on me. Ashley had started bringing me lunch every day, claiming she was in the neighborhood but clearly worried about my emotional state. Ryan seemed frustrated by my inability to move past what he continued to characterize as a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. He wanted me to accept his mother's lunch invitation and work toward rebuilding whatever relationship we'd had before the shower. When I tried to explain that Linda had never actually liked or accepted me, he accused me of being paranoid and creating problems where none existed. The final straw came when Ryan suggested that maybe we should postpone the wedding until after the baby was born, just to give everyone time to adjust and reduce the stress of planning 2 major life events simultaneously. He presented this as his own practical idea, but I recognized Linda's fingerprints all over the suggestion. That was when I understood that Linda's attack at the baby shower had achieved exactly what she'd intended. She had planted enough doubt in Ryan's mind about our relationship and readiness for marriage that he was now suggesting we delay the wedding indefinitely. She had successfully repositioned herself as the voice of reason, while making me appear demanding and unreasonable for wanting to proceed with our original plans. Standing in my apartment that afternoon, looking at the engagement ring that suddenly felt heavy on my finger, I realized I was facing a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of my life. I could continue fighting for a place in a family that didn't want me, hoping that time and persistence would eventually win Linda's acceptance and Ryan's unwavering support. Or I could acknowledge that this situation was fundamentally unsustainable and make the painful decision to prioritize my own dignity and my child's future well-being over a relationship that required me to accept continuous disrespect. The baby moved inside me for the first time that evening, a flutter that should have been magical but instead felt like a reminder of how complicated everything had become. This tiny person deserved to be born into a family where they were completely wanted and celebrated, not one where their very existence was seen as an inconvenience or mistake. I spent that night making lists of practical considerations, trying to approach this decision with logic rather than just emotion. Could I afford to raise a child on my own? Would Ryan pay child support even if we weren't married? Where would I live? How would I manage work and childcare? What kind of custody arrangement would be fair to everyone involved? But underneath all the practical questions was a deeper realization that had been building since the baby shower. I couldn't spend the rest of my life fighting for respect from people who were determined not to give it. I couldn't raise a child in an environment where their mother was consistently undermined and diminished. And I couldn't stay engaged to someone who wasn't willing or able to defend our relationship when it mattered most. The decision crystallized slowly, like morning fog lifting to reveal a landscape that had been there all along but obscured by wishful thinking and fear of change. I was going to leave Atlanta, leave Ryan, and start over somewhere that nobody knew about Linda Thompson's assessment of my worthiness or her successful campaign to sabotage our relationship. The plan formed gradually over the next week as I researched cities with good job markets and affordable living costs for single mothers. Denver kept appearing on my lists of possibilities, with its growing economy, reasonable cost of living, and distance from everyone who had witnessed my humiliation. It was far enough away to represent a true fresh start, but close enough that I could drive back for emergencies if necessary. I gave my notice at Henderson & Associates with 2 weeks' warning, telling my supervisor that I had received an opportunity in Denver that I couldn't pass up. It wasn't exactly a lie, since the opportunity was to start over with my dignity intact and my child's future as my priority. Ashley tried to talk me out of leaving, arguing that running away wouldn't solve the fundamental problems with Ryan and Linda, but I explained that I wasn't running away from conflict. I was moving toward a life where I didn't have to fight for basic respect every single day. The conversation with Ryan about my decision was one of the most difficult of my life. I had rehearsed various explanations, but when the moment came, I simply told him that I couldn't marry into a family where I would never be accepted, and he would never fully support me against his mother's attacks. I wasn't trying to keep him from the baby, but I also wasn't going to spend my life being diminished by people who saw my pregnancy as a trap rather than a blessing. His response was exactly what I'd expected and feared. He accused me of overreacting to his mother's concerns, of being unwilling to work through normal family challenges, of making a permanent decision based on temporary emotions. When I reminded him that he'd suggested postponing our wedding, he claimed that was just practical planning, not a reflection of any doubts about our relationship. The most painful part of that conversation was realizing that Ryan genuinely couldn't see what his mother had done or understand why it was unacceptable. In his mind, Linda had expressed legitimate concerns about our readiness for marriage and parenthood, and my reaction proved we weren't mature enough to handle constructive criticism. He saw my decision to leave as confirmation that his mother had been right about our relationship all along. I packed my belongings systematically over 10 days, selling furniture I couldn't take and boxing everything else for a moving company that specialized in long-distance relocations. Sophia flew up from Miami to help and to try one more time to convince me that leaving was a mistake. But even she had to admit that staying would mean years of fighting battles I might never win. The baby shower gifts posed a particular challenge. Part of me wanted to return everything to avoid feeling like I was stealing from people who had celebrated a marriage that wasn't going to happen. But Sophia pointed out that those gifts were for the baby, not for my relationship with Ryan, and that our child would need everything regardless of whether their parents were married. On my last night in Atlanta, I sat in my empty apartment surrounded by boxes and tried to imagine what my life might have looked like if Linda had simply accepted me as Ryan's choice. Would we have been happy? Would the marriage have lasted? Would our children have grown up in a stable, loving family where everyone felt valued and respected? But there was no point in imagining alternate realities where Linda was a different person or Ryan was more willing to prioritize our relationship over family peace. I was dealing with the situation as it actually existed, not as I wished it could be. And in this reality, staying would have meant accepting a lifetime of being treated as a second-class member of my own family. The drive to Denver took 2 days, with an overnight stop in Kansas City that gave me time to second-guess my decision one more time. I called Ashley from my hotel room and admitted that I was terrified of starting over in a city where I knew nobody, with a baby coming and no clear plan for supporting myself. She reminded me that I was strong enough to handle whatever came next, that I'd already survived the worst part by choosing to leave, and that my child would be lucky to have a mother who refused to accept being treated badly. Denver welcomed me with clear mountain air and possibilities I couldn't have imagined while sitting in that community center, listening to Linda Thompson explain why I wasn't good enough for her son. I didn't know it yet, but the humiliation she'd orchestrated at my baby shower would turn out to be the catalyst that launched me toward a life far better than anything I could have built, while constantly fighting for acceptance from people determined not to give it. As I unpacked my first box in my small Capitol Hill apartment, feeling the baby move inside me and looking out at the Rocky Mountains in the distance, I realized that Linda Thompson had done me the greatest favor of my life. Her cruelty had freed me from a situation that would have slowly eroded my self-worth over decades. Her sabotage had pushed me toward a future where I could build something authentic and meaningful, instead of spending my energy trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. I had no idea what came next, but for the first time since that devastating afternoon surrounded by baby shower wreckage, I felt like myself again. The woman who had driven away from Atlanta wasn't the same person who had stood frozen in humiliation while her future mother-in-law delivered a calculated attack designed to destroy her engagement. I was someone who had chosen dignity over comfort, uncertainty over disrespect, and my child's future over the familiar pain of trying to please people who could never be pleased. The baby kicked as if in agreement with my decision, and I placed my hand on my growing belly and made a promise. This child would never have to fight for acceptance from people who should love them unconditionally. They would never see their mother accept mistreatment or minimize her own worth to maintain peace. They would grow up knowing that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to value what you bring to their lives. Linda Thompson thought she had won by driving me away from her son and disrupting Argument's wedding plans. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed me the motivation and freedom to build a life that would make her regret every cruel word she'd spoken at my baby shower. The reality of Denver hit me 3 days after arriving when I realized I had $17 left in my checking account, and my savings would cover exactly 6 weeks of rent if I ate nothing but ramen noodles and never turned on the heat. My small Capitol Hill apartment felt like a prison cell painted in cheerful yellow by previous tenants, who probably never had to choose between groceries and electricity. The mountain views that had seemed so inspiring during my apartment hunt now mocked me through windows I couldn't afford to properly insulate against Colorado's approaching winter. I sat on my second-hand couch, which I'd bought from a college student for $45, and stared at my laptop screen showing Indeed.com job listings that required experience I didn't have in a city where I knew absolutely no one. Marketing coordinator positions wanted 3 to 5 years of local market experience. Administrative roles paid barely enough to cover rent, let alone health insurance for a pregnant woman with no existing doctor relationships in a new state. The morning sickness that had been manageable in Atlanta became overwhelming in Denver's altitude, leaving me nauseated and exhausted in ways that made job hunting feel impossible. I would force myself to get dressed and walk to coffee shops with free Wi-Fi, hoping to appear professional while filling out online applications, but inevitably ended up rushing to public restrooms to vomit, or simply sitting in my car afterward, trying to gather enough energy to drive home. My sister Sophia called every day from Miami, her voice carefully cheerful as she asked about my settling-in process and offered to wire money that I knew she couldn't afford on her teacher's salary. I appreciated her concern but couldn't bring myself to admit how desperate my situation had become. Accepting help would mean acknowledging that leaving Atlanta might have been a terrible mistake, that maybe Linda Thompson had been right about my lack of readiness for adult responsibilities. Ashley sent care packages from Atlanta filled with my favorite snacks and encouraging notes, but her texts revealed that word had spread about my abrupt departure. Mutual friends were asking questions she couldn't answer, and the official story seemed to be that I'd suffered some kind of pregnancy-related emotional breakdown that caused me to flee the city. Ryan apparently wasn't sharing details about our breakup, which allowed speculation to flourish about my mental stability and decision-making capabilities. The isolation was suffocating in ways I hadn't anticipated. In Atlanta, even during the worst moments with Linda's manipulations, I'd had coworkers to grab lunch with, neighbors I recognized walking their dogs, familiar grocery store clerks who smiled when they saw me coming. Denver felt like living inside a snow globe where I could observe normal life happening around me, but couldn't quite reach through the glass to participate. My prenatal care became another source of stress and confusion. The clinic I'd found through my temporary insurance accepted walk-in appointments, but the waiting room was always crowded with women who seemed to have their lives together in ways I definitely didn't. They arrived with supportive partners, talked casually about nursery preparations and baby shower plans, and exchanged contact information for mommy groups I couldn't imagine joining. During my first appointment, the nurse practitioner asked routine questions about my support system and birth plan that revealed how completely unprepared I was for single motherhood in a new city. When she inquired about my emergency contact, I realized I didn't have anyone in Colorado who could reach the hospital within hours if something went wrong. The realization that I might go through labor and delivery completely alone sent me into a panic attack right there in the examination room. The financial pressure intensified when I received a bill for the prenatal visit that consumed another chunk of my dwindling savings. I started calculating how long I could survive without income and realized I had perhaps 10 days before I'd need to choose between rent and food. The stress was affecting my pregnancy in measurable ways. My blood pressure was elevated, I'd lost weight instead of gaining it, and the baby seemed less active than the pregnancy books suggested was normal. 3 weeks into my Denver experiment, I sat in a 24-hour diner at 2 in the morning because my apartment felt too small to contain my growing panic, and this was the only place I could afford that provided warmth and somewhere to sit for hours. The night waitress, a woman named Carmen who looked like she'd heard every sob story imaginable, brought me free coffee refills and pretended not to notice when I discreetly cried into my eggs. The other customers were an eclectic mix of night shift workers, insomniacs, and people like me who had nowhere else to go. At the counter sat a man in hospital scrubs who looked exhausted beyond measure, probably finishing a double shift. A young couple in the corner booth spoke in hushed tones about bills they couldn't pay and jobs they needed to find. An elderly woman worked crossword puzzles with fierce concentration, her purse clutched tightly against her side. I realized I wasn't the only person in Denver struggling to make life work, but somehow that knowledge didn't provide the comfort I'd expected. Instead, it made me understand that plenty of people faced financial hardship and uncertainty without the luxury of family support or emergency backup plans. I'd voluntarily placed myself in this position by choosing pride over practical considerations, and now I needed to find solutions instead of feeling sorry for myself. The breaking point came the next morning when I discovered my car wouldn't start, probably due to a dead battery that would cost money I didn't have to replace. Standing in the apartment complex parking lot at 7 in the morning, dressed for another day of job hunting, staring at my car that represented my only reliable transportation in a city where I knew no one, I finally acknowledged that I was in serious trouble. I walked back upstairs and sat on my couch with my laptop, no longer browsing job listings but instead researching options I'd been too proud to consider. Social services for pregnant women, emergency assistance programs, food banks, shelters that accepted pregnant women. The resources existed, but accessing them would require admitting that I'd failed spectacularly at this attempt to start over. The phone call to Sophia was the hardest conversation I'd ever initiated. I had to tell my sister, who had supported my decision to leave Atlanta and encouraged my independence, that I was essentially destitute and potentially homeless in a city 1,500 miles from anyone who cared about me. Her response was immediate and practical. She was wiring money for emergency expenses and driving to Denver to bring me home to Miami where I could stay with her until I figured out my next steps. But as I waited for her money transfer to clear, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was hormones or desperation, or simply the survival instinct that pregnancy hormones amplify, but I found myself getting angry instead of defeated. Linda Thompson had succeeded in driving me away from her son, but she didn't get to determine how my story ended. I'd left Atlanta to build a life where I could raise my child with dignity and independence, and giving up after 3 weeks would prove that her assessment of my capabilities had been correct. That afternoon, while walking to the bank to collect Sophia's emergency wire transfer, I passed a small event planning company that had a handwritten "Help Wanted" sign in the window. The storefront looked busy, despite its modest size, with people coming and going carrying flower arrangements and coordinating delivery schedules. Something about the energy of the place drew me inside, even though I had no experience in event planning and probably looked like someone seeking charity rather than employment. The owner, Maria Rodriguez, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested she'd built her business through determination rather than inheritance. She was juggling 3 phone calls while coordinating a delivery crisis, and when I approached her desk, she held up one finger to indicate I should wait while she resolved whatever emergency was unfolding. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching Maria handle clients, vendors, and employees with efficiency and grace that reminded me why I'd always been drawn to organizational challenges. She solved problems quickly, anticipated potential complications, and somehow maintained warmth and humor while managing multiple crises simultaneously. This was the kind of work environment I'd been hoping to find, even if I'd never considered event planning as a career path. When Maria finally had a moment to talk, I introduced myself and asked about the help wanted sign, expecting her to direct me to fill out an application or explain that the position required experience I didn't have. Instead, she looked me up and down with sharp eyes and asked if I was available to start immediately helping with a wedding emergency that required someone who could follow directions and wasn't afraid of hard work. The next 6 hours were a whirlwind of flower arrangements, table settings, and crisis management as we transformed a hotel ballroom for a wedding reception that was supposed to begin in 4 hours. The bride's original event planner had disappeared 2 days earlier, leaving Maria to salvage what should have been the happiest day of this couple's life. I carried centerpieces, assembled place cards, coordinated with caterers, and helped solve dozens of small problems that collectively threatened to ruin the entire celebration. Maria worked with intensity that matched her speaking pace, but she also explained what she was doing and why, treating me like a trainee rather than just temporary labor. She showed me how to create elegant table arrangements on a limited budget, how to manage vendor relationships when things went wrong, and how to maintain calm authority when clients were on the verge of emotional breakdowns. When the bride arrived for photos and saw her reception space transformed into something more beautiful than she'd originally envisioned, her tears of gratitude made me understand why Maria had chosen this profession. We'd taken a potential disaster and turned it into a celebration that would become a treasured memory for this couple and their families. The work was physically demanding and stressful, but it was also creative and meaningful in ways my previous marketing job had never been. After the wedding guests departed and we'd finished cleanup, Maria offered me a cup of coffee and asked about my background. I found myself telling her an abbreviated version of my Atlanta story, focusing on my marketing experience and organizational skills, while mentioning that I was starting over in Denver due to personal circumstances. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my computer skills or ability to handle multiple projects simultaneously. Then she offered me a position that was part administrative assistant, part event coordinator trainee, and part whatever needed doing on any given day. The salary was modest but included health insurance after 60 days, and she was willing to work around medical appointments and pregnancy-related scheduling needs. The job wasn't glamorous, but it offered something I desperately needed: a chance to prove myself in an environment where hard work and reliability would be valued more than my history or connections. I accepted immediately, probably too eagerly, but Maria seemed pleased rather than suspicious about my enthusiasm. She explained that her business had grown faster than her staff, and she needed someone who could learn quickly and handle the organizational details that kept everything functioning smoothly. My marketing background would be useful for expanding their online presence, and my willingness to jump into wedding emergencies suggested I could handle the unpredictable demands of event planning. That night, I called Sophia to tell her about the job offer and my decision to stay in Denver. She was concerned about my making major decisions while emotionally vulnerable, but I explained that this felt like the first genuinely positive development since arriving in Colorado. Maria had hired me based on my performance during a crisis, not despite my circumstances, and the work itself felt like something I could build a career around. The conversation with Ryan was more difficult but necessary. I needed to establish boundaries about communication and make it clear that I wasn't returning to Atlanta or resuming our engagement. He seemed relieved to hear I'd found employment, but he still couldn't understand why I was determined to raise our child in a city where I had no family support. When I tried to explain that I was building the kind of life I wanted, rather than accepting the one his family offered, he accused me of being stubborn and unrealistic about the challenges of single parenthood. His suggestion that I move back to Atlanta and we could work things out revealed that he still didn't understand why I'd left. He seemed to think this was a temporary rebellion that would end when I realized how difficult independent living could be. The possibility that I might actually prefer struggling on my own to accepting a place in his family where I'd never be fully welcomed apparently hadn't occurred to him. I told him I'd established Denver residency and planned to stay here for the foreseeable future, that I wanted him to be involved in our child's life but wouldn't be returning to Georgia. If he wanted to visit the baby or eventually pursue custody arrangements, we could work out something fair, but I was building my life in Colorado with or without his participation. The finality in my voice seemed to surprise him, and for the first time since the baby shower, Ryan sounded genuinely concerned about losing access to our child. He'd been so focused on his mother's objections to our relationship that he hadn't considered how my leaving Atlanta would affect his ability to be an active father. The geographic distance I'd created to escape Linda's influence would also limit his involvement in day-to-day parenting decisions and milestones. That realization led to our most honest conversation since the pregnancy began. Ryan admitted that his mother's behavior at the baby shower had been inappropriate and hurtful, though he still insisted she'd been motivated by concern rather than malice. He acknowledged that he should have defended me more forcefully, but claimed he'd been trying to maintain family peace rather than take sides in what he saw as a misunderstanding between two strong-willed women. I explained that Linda's attack hadn't been a misunderstanding or a clash of personalities, but a calculated attempt to humiliate me into ending our engagement. The fact that her strategy had ultimately succeeded didn't make it acceptable or forgivable. More importantly, Ryan's inability to recognize the deliberate cruelty in his mother's behavior suggested we had fundamentally different values about respect and family dynamics. The conversation ended with both of us acknowledging that our relationship was permanently changed, even if we eventually found ways to co-parent effectively. I wasn't trying to punish him by moving to Denver, but I also wasn't going to sacrifice my emotional well-being to make his life more convenient. Our child deserved parents who were both healthy and stable, even if that meant they lived in different states. My first weeks working for Maria were challenging in ways that had nothing to do with pregnancy or personal circumstances. Event planning required skills I'd never developed, and attention to details that could make the difference between a magical celebration and a complete disaster. I learned to manage vendor relationships, coordinate complex timelines, and handle client expectations while maintaining the kind of calm professionalism that masks whatever chaos might be happening behind the scenes. Maria proved to be an exceptional mentor who shared her expertise generously while expecting high standards and quick learning. She taught me about the business aspects of event planning, from initial client consultations to final invoice collections, and gradually gave me more responsibility as my competence and confidence improved. Within a month, I was handling initial vendor contacts and managing smaller events with minimal supervision. The physical demands of the job were significant, especially as my pregnancy progressed, but Maria accommodated my needs without making me feel like a burden. She arranged for other staff members to handle heavy lifting and long periods of standing, while ensuring I remained involved in the creative and organizational aspects that utilized my skills most effectively. Her matter-of-fact approach to pregnancy as a temporary condition rather than a disability helped me maintain my professional identity during a time when I felt like everything else about my life was uncertain. The financial stability, while modest, allowed me to establish routines that made Denver feel more like home and less like a temporary refuge. I found a local grocery store where the staff recognized me, and a coffee shop where I could work on my laptop when Maria needed me to handle administrative tasks remotely. I discovered a community center that offered prenatal yoga classes and gradually began meeting other women who were navigating pregnancy and new motherhood in Denver. These connections weren't deep friendships yet, but they represented the beginning of a social network that wasn't based on my relationship with Ryan or my history in Atlanta. These women knew me only as Emma, the event planner who was expecting her first baby and building a life in Denver. They didn't know about Linda Thompson's assessment of my worthiness or the humiliation I'd endured at my baby shower. To them, I was simply another working woman preparing for motherhood while managing career responsibilities. The work itself was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in Atlanta. Each event presented unique challenges that required creativity, problem-solving skills, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. I helped families celebrate milestone anniversaries, coordinated corporate events that required sophisticated logistics, and assisted with wedding preparations that involved months of detailed planning. Every successful event felt like a personal victory and proof of my growing competence in this new field. Maria began including me in client meetings and vendor negotiations, recognizing that my marketing background gave me insights about presentation and communication that complemented her operational expertise. She encouraged me to develop the online presence for her business, creating social media content and a website that showcased their work more effectively. The collaboration felt like genuine partnership rather than hierarchical employment, and I began to understand what it meant to work in an environment where my contributions were valued and acknowledged. As my second trimester progressed and my energy levels improved, I started taking evening classes in event management and wedding planning through the community college. The coursework was challenging but directly applicable to my daily work, and the certification programs would eventually give me credentials that matched my growing experience. Maria supported this professional development by adjusting my schedule to accommodate classes and encouraging me to apply what I was learning to real client situations. The emotional healing happened more gradually than the professional growth, but it was equally important to my overall recovery from the Atlanta experience. Every day that I successfully managed event planning challenges without anyone questioning my capabilities or suggesting I wasn't ready for the responsibility helped rebuild confidence that Linda Thompson's assessment had damaged. When clients praised my organizational skills or thanked me for helping make their celebrations perfect, I remembered what it felt like to be appreciated rather than merely tolerated. The pregnancy progressed normally despite the stress of major life changes, and I began to feel genuine excitement about motherhood rather than just anxiety about doing it alone. The baby's movements became more pronounced and regular, and I started thinking about nursery preparations and choosing a pediatrician instead of just worrying about survival and basic financial stability. I was building a life that could accommodate a child, not just enduring circumstances until something better came along. My relationship with Sophia improved as she saw that my Denver life was stabilizing rather than deteriorating. She visited for a long weekend and met Maria, saw my work environment, and admitted that I seemed happier and more confident than I'd been during the final months in Atlanta. She could see that this wasn't just stubborn pride keeping me away from Ryan's family, but genuine progress toward independence and professional fulfillment. The conversation with Ashley was more complicated because she remained loyal to our shared history while also maintaining friendships with people who had witnessed my baby shower humiliation. She reported that Ryan seemed depressed and confused about my refusal to reconcile, and that Linda had been telling people I'd had some kind of breakdown that caused me to abandon my responsibilities. The narrative emerging in Atlanta painted me as emotionally unstable, rather than someone who had made a rational decision to escape a toxic situation. I realized that I didn't care what story people in Atlanta told themselves about my departure. Their opinions were based on incomplete information and influenced by relationships with people who had incentives to minimize their own role in driving me away. The only assessment that mattered was my own understanding of what I'd accomplished by choosing difficulty over disrespect. By my 6th month of pregnancy, I had established routines and relationships that made Denver feel like home rather than exile. I had work that challenged and fulfilled me, healthcare providers who knew my history and supported my birth plan, and financial stability that allowed me to prepare for motherhood without panic. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I could build a life based on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to earn acceptance from people who were determined not to give it. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but the foundation was solid. I was no longer the woman who had stood frozen in humiliation while Linda Thompson delivered her calculated attack at my baby shower. I was someone who had chosen her own future over comfortable familiarity, who had learned new skills when survival required them, and who was building the kind of life she wanted to model for her child. Linda Thompson had succeeded in driving me away from her son, but she had failed to break my spirit or prove her assessment of my inadequacy. Instead, her cruelty had forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed and create opportunities I never would have pursued if I'd remained in Atlanta trying to please people who could never be satisfied. The decision to stay in Denver permanently wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather the natural conclusion of 6 months of steady progress toward independence and professional competence. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was building towards something that belonged entirely to me and my growing child. This was the life I chose, not the one someone else decided I deserved. The winter in Denver tested everything I thought I'd learned about survival and determination. Colorado cold was different from Atlanta's mild winters, cutting through my inadequate coat and reminding me daily that I was still figuring out how to live in this city. My apartment's heating bills tripled, forcing me to choose between comfort and groceries more often than I wanted to admit. I learned to layer clothes, use space heaters strategically, and accept that being slightly cold was better than being completely broke. Maria's business slowed during the winter months. as fewer couples chose snowy Colorado for outdoor weddings and corporate events shifted to spring planning cycles. My hours were reduced accordingly, stretching my already tight budget even thinner. I picked up freelance marketing projects in the evenings, working on laptop campaigns for small businesses, while my swollen feet soaked in warm water and my back ached from the second-hand desk chair I'd bought for $15. The isolation of winter combined with pregnancy hormones created emotional challenges I hadn't anticipated. Some days I felt strong and capable, proud of the life I was building from nothing. Other days I sat in my apartment wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by choosing independence over the financial security that Ryan's family could have provided. The doubt was worse during snowstorms when the city shut down and I couldn't leave my apartment for days at a time. My prenatal appointments became increasingly important not just for medical care but for human connection. Dr. Patricia Williams was a no-nonsense obstetrician who treated me like an adult capable of making informed decisions rather than a charity case deserving pity. She answered my questions about labor and delivery with straightforward information, helped me understand what to expect as a single mother, and connected me with resources for childbirth education and postpartum support. The childbirth classes were my first real social interaction with other pregnant women in Denver. Most of the couples were older and more established than I was, with houses in the suburbs and nurseries already decorated in carefully coordinated themes. I felt conspicuous as the only single woman in the group, but the instructor, a former labor and delivery nurse named Janet, made sure I never felt excluded from discussions or exercises. During one particularly difficult class about pain management during labor, I realized that I would be going through delivery without a partner to advocate for me or help me communicate with medical staff during intense moments. The thought terrified me in ways that financial stress and professional uncertainty hadn't. I would be completely responsible for making decisions about my own care and my baby's well-being while experiencing the most physically demanding event of my life. Janet approached me after class and suggested I consider hiring a doula, a birth support specialist who could provide the advocacy and emotional support that partners typically offered. The cost was beyond my budget, but she knew someone who was completing doula training and needed to attend births as part of her certification process. This woman, Carmen Santos, was willing to provide services for free in exchange for the learning experience and reference letter. Meeting Carmen was like discovering a missing piece of my support system that I hadn't known I needed. She was a mother of 3 who had returned to school for nursing while working part-time as a doula, and she understood the challenges of navigating pregnancy and childbirth without traditional family support. Her presence at my remaining prenatal appointments helped me feel more confident about advocating for myself and understanding my options during labor. Spring arrived slowly in Denver, with late snowstorms that frustrated my attempts to walk more during my 3rd trimester. But as the weather improved and Maria's business picked up again, I found myself handling increasingly complex events and taking on responsibilities that stretched my skills in exciting ways. Maria began sending me to represent the company at vendor meetings and bridal shows, trusting me to present our services professionally and build relationships that could generate future business. The bridal shows were a revelation about the wedding industry that I'd never understood while planning my own canceled celebration. I watched hundreds of engaged couples navigate booth after booth of vendors, making decisions about flowers, photography, catering, and entertainment that would determine the tone and success of their weddings. The complexity of coordinating all these elements while managing family expectations and budget constraints gave me new appreciation for what Maria accomplished with each event. My growing expertise in multicultural celebrations became an unexpected specialty that set our company apart from competitors. My own Mexican-American background, combined with Denver's diverse population, created opportunities to plan quinceañeras, fusion weddings, and cultural celebrations that required understanding of traditions many other planners couldn't navigate. Maria encouraged me to develop this niche, recognizing that it could become a significant revenue source for the business. The first quinceañera I planned independently was for the Rodriguez family, whose daughter Sofia was turning 15, and wanted a celebration that honored her grandmother's Mexican traditions while incorporating contemporary elements that reflected her own personality. The event required coordinating with mariachi bands, traditional caterers, and custom dress designers, while managing a guest list of over 200 people and a budget that needed to stretch across multiple cultural requirements. Working with the Rodriguez family taught me about the deep emotional significance that these celebrations held for immigrant families, who were using these events to maintain cultural connections while building new lives in America. Sofia's quinceañera wasn't just a party, it was a statement about family values, cultural pride, and the successful integration of tradition with contemporary American life. The pressure to get every detail right was intense, but so was the satisfaction when the celebration exceeded their expectations. The success of Sofia's quinceañera led to referrals from other Latino families in Denver, who had been searching for an event planner who understood their cultural requirements and could execute celebrations that felt authentic rather than stereotypical. Within months, I was handling multiple cultural celebrations each month, building relationships with specialty vendors, and developing expertise in traditions from Mexico, Colombia, and other Latin American countries. Maria recognized that my cultural specialty was becoming a significant differentiator for the business and suggested that we formalize it into a dedicated service line. She offered to make me a partner in developing this aspect of the company, with increased responsibility and compensation that reflected the revenue I was generating. The opportunity was both exciting and terrifying, as it would require me to commit fully to Denver and this career path, rather than keeping options open for eventual return to Atlanta. The partnership discussions forced me to evaluate honestly what I wanted my professional future to look like. Event planning had started as survival employment, but it had evolved into work that felt meaningful and matched my skills in ways that marketing never had. The creative problem-solving, client relationship management, and cultural bridge-building aspects of the job engaged parts of my personality that had been dormant during my Atlanta career. My pregnancy was progressing normally, but the physical demands of event work were becoming more challenging as I entered my third trimester. Setting up venues required hours of standing and walking that left me exhausted, and the irregular schedule of weekend events made it difficult to maintain the rest routine that my doctor recommended. Maria worked with me to adjust my responsibilities, focusing more on planning and vendor coordination, while other staff handled the physically demanding setup work. The baby's nursery came together slowly, as my budget allowed for small purchases and friends contributed items they no longer needed. Carmen connected me with a network of single mothers in Denver who shared resources and support in ways that traditional family structures typically provided. Through this group, I acquired a crib, changing table, and most of the baby gear I needed without spending money I couldn't afford. The baby shower that this group of women organized for me was everything my Atlanta shower should have been. Held in Carmen's backyard on a warm May afternoon, it was intimate and supportive, focused on practical gifts and genuine celebration, rather than social obligations or family politics. The women who attended were there because they wanted to support me and welcome my baby, not because invitation protocols required their presence. During this celebration, I realized how different my life had become from what I'd planned in Atlanta. These women knew me as Emma, the event planner who was building a business and preparing for single motherhood, not as Ryan's fiancé who had somehow disappointed his mother's expectations. Their assessment of my readiness for parenthood was based on my demonstrated competence and preparation, not on family approval or relationship status. Ryan's calls became less frequent as my due date approached, but they were increasingly focused on logistics rather than reconciliation attempts. He wanted to know about hospital plans and visiting arrangements, information about the baby's pediatrician and my postpartum support system. The conversations were civil but distant, like former acquaintances catching up, rather than parents preparing to welcome their first child together. His questions revealed how completely my life had diverged from anything he could understand or relate to. When I described my doula arrangement and the support network of single mothers I'd connected with, he seemed confused about why I would choose these alternatives instead of accepting help from his family. The possibility that I preferred my chosen family to his biological one apparently remained incomprehensible to him. Linda Thompson never called directly, but Ryan occasionally mentioned her concerns about my isolation from family support and her offers to help with baby expenses if I would consider returning to Atlanta after delivery. These offers came with conditions about visitation rights and input on parenting decisions that made clear they were attempts to regain control rather than genuine assistance. I declined politely but firmly, explaining that I had established adequate support systems in Denver, The final weeks of pregnancy were simultaneously the most physically uncomfortable and emotionally confident period of my journey to single motherhood. My body was ready to be finished with pregnancy, but my mind was calm about the approaching birth and early parenting challenges. I had educated myself thoroughly about labor and delivery, established relationships with medical providers I trusted, and created support systems that would help me navigate the transition to motherhood. Maria insisted that I take 6 weeks of maternity leave with partial pay, a generous arrangement that reflected both her recognition of my value to the business and her understanding of the financial realities of new motherhood. She had lined up temporary help for the events scheduled during my absence and promised that my cultural celebration clients would wait for my return rather than finding other planners. The morning my labor began, I followed the birth plan Carmen and I had developed, timing contractions at home until they were close enough to warrant going to the hospital. Carmen met me at my apartment and drove me to the medical center, providing calm reassurance as the intensity of contractions increased. Having someone there who understood the process and could advocate for my preferences with medical staff made me feel prepared rather than panicked. Labor lasted 14 hours, which Dr. Williams assured me was normal for a first birth. Carmen's presence was invaluable during the most difficult phases, helping me maintain focus on breathing techniques and advocating for my preferences when hospital staff suggested interventions I wanted to avoid unless medically necessary. She photographed the moments after delivery when I was too overwhelmed to think about documentation. My daughter, Isabella Marie Martinez, was born at 3 in the morning on June 15th, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire maternity ward. Holding her for the first time, I felt overwhelming love, combined with fierce protectiveness and determination to provide her with everything she needed to thrive. This tiny person was worth every sacrifice I'd made and every challenge I'd overcome to create this life for us. Ryan flew to Denver 2 days after Isabella's birth, meeting his daughter for the first time in my hospital room. His reaction was everything I could have hoped for in terms of immediate paternal bonding, and watching him hold her with wonder and obvious love reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him originally. Whatever problems we'd had as a couple, he was clearly going to be a devoted father. The hospital visit was emotionally complicated, as Ryan seemed genuinely surprised by how well I'd prepared for motherhood and how competent I appeared in caring for Isabella. He'd apparently expected to find me overwhelmed and in need of rescue, possibly validating his mother's concerns about my readiness for single parenthood. Instead, he found me confidently breastfeeding, comfortable with diaper changes, and surrounded by flowers and gifts from my Denver support network. Carmen's assistance during the first weeks home was crucial in establishing routines and building my confidence as a new mother. She helped me navigate breastfeeding challenges, provided practical guidance about infant care, and connected me with pediatric resources in Denver. Her experience as a mother of 3 gave her insights about normal newborn behavior that prevented me from panicking about every minor concern. The transition back to work after 6 weeks was challenging but manageable, due to Maria's flexibility about scheduling and her willingness to accommodate my needs as a breastfeeding mother. I brought Isabella to the office when possible and worked from home when her schedule or my energy levels required it. Maria had become more than an employer. She was a mentor who understood that supporting my success as a mother was essential to maintaining my value as an employee. My first major event after returning to work was a Mexican-American fusion wedding that required coordinating traditional elements with contemporary celebration styles. Planning this wedding while managing new motherhood pushed my organizational skills to new levels, but the successful execution proved to myself and Maria that I could handle complex professional responsibilities while caring for Isabella. The cultural celebration business continued growing as word spread about my expertise and ability to create authentic experiences that honored family traditions while appealing to American-born generations. Young couples who had struggled to find vendors who understood their cultural requirements were grateful to work with someone who could navigate both worlds successfully. This specialty was becoming the foundation for something larger than just employment with Maria's company. By Isabella's 6-month birthday, I had established routines that made single motherhood feel manageable rather than overwhelming. My daughter was healthy and developing normally, reaching milestones that filled me with pride and wonder. My professional reputation was growing beyond Maria's company, and I was beginning to envision possibilities for eventually launching my own business specializing in multicultural celebrations. The financial struggles that had defined my first year in Denver were gradually easing as my income increased and I learned to manage expenses more effectively. I was able to move to a slightly larger apartment with better heating and a dedicated nursery for Isabella. The constant worry about making rent and buying groceries was replaced by careful budgeting that allowed for occasional luxuries, like dinner out or new clothes that fit my post-pregnancy body. More importantly, I had proven to myself that the life I was building was sustainable and fulfilling, rather than just survival. Isabella was thriving, in an environment where she was completely wanted and celebrated, surrounded by chosen family who valued both of us. My work was meaningful and utilized skills I'd discovered, rather than just endured. The independence I'd chosen over family acceptance had led to achievements that belonged entirely to me. The Christmas when Isabella was 7 months old marked 18 months since I'd left Atlanta in humiliation and fear. Looking at my daughter playing under the small tree in our cozy apartment while I planned spring weddings at my kitchen table, I could barely recognize the woman who had fled Georgia convinced she was inadequate for adult responsibilities. That woman had been broken by other people's assessments of her worth. This woman was building something valuable from her own vision and effort. Ryan visited Denver every few months to spend time with Isabella, and our interactions had settled into cordial co-parenting rather than romantic tension. He was a good father during his visits, clearly devoted to his daughter, but he remained unable to understand why I'd chosen difficulty over the comfort his family could have provided. His life in Atlanta appeared unchanged, except for the addition of fatherhood responsibilities that geography made challenging. Linda Thompson had never acknowledged Isabella's existence directly, though Ryan mentioned that she occasionally asked about her granddaughter's development. She had apparently never forgiven me for depriving her of control over her son's family situation, and her continued coldness toward Isabella was simply extension of her rejection of me. I felt sorry for my daughter's loss of a grandmother relationship, but I was grateful that Isabella wouldn't grow up feeling inadequate in Linda's eyes. The contrast between Linda's rejection and my Denver community's embrace of Isabella reinforced my decision to build life where we were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. My daughter was growing up surrounded by people who saw her as blessing rather than inconvenience, who supported her mother's choices rather than questioning them constantly. This was the environment I wanted to model for her, about relationships and self-worth. As Isabella's first birthday approached, I was planning not just her celebration, but also the launch of my own event planning business, specializing in multicultural celebrations. Maria had encouraged this venture, offering to serve as mentor and referring clients whose needs exceeded her current capacity. The business plan I developed during evening hours while Isabella slept represented my transition from survival mode to genuine entrepreneurship. The woman who had been humiliated at her baby shower for being inadequate and unprepared was now launching a business built on her cultural expertise and demonstrated competence. Linda Thompson's assessment of my capabilities had been proven wrong by every milestone I'd achieved since leaving Atlanta. Her attempt to drive me away from her son had instead launched me toward a life that was more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have built while trying to earn her approval. Isabella's first birthday party was held in the community center where I'd first attended prenatal classes, surrounded by the chosen family of single mothers, work colleagues, and friends who had supported us throughout our first year in Denver. The celebration was joyful and relaxed, focused on appreciating how far we'd both come rather than dwelling on challenges we'd overcome. Watching my daughter take her first tentative steps across the community center floor, applauded by people who genuinely loved us both, I understood that Linda Thompson's cruelty had been the catalyst that freed me to become the person I was meant to be. Her rejection had forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The life I was living wasn't the one I'd planned in Atlanta, but it was infinitely better than anything I could have achieved, while constantly trying to prove my worth to people determined not to recognize it. Isabella was growing up in an environment where she would never question her fundamental value or accept treatment that diminished her dignity. This was the legacy I wanted to leave her. The knowledge that she could create her own path, rather than accepting whatever role others assigned to her. The morning I signed the lease for my own office space, Isabella was 18 months old and walking with the determined wobble of toddlers who have places to go and things to explore. She accompanied me to the small storefront in Denver's Arts District, crawling around the empty rooms while I measured spaces and envisioned how to transform them into the headquarters for Celebraciones Emma, the multicultural event planning business that had grown from survival necessity into genuine passion. The space was modest but perfectly located in a neighborhood that attracted young professionals and diverse families seeking authentic cultural experiences. Large windows faced the street, providing natural light and visibility for potential clients walking past. The previous tenant had been a florist, leaving behind built-in displays that I could adapt for showcasing cultural decoration examples and wedding inspiration boards. Maria had been instrumental in encouraging this transition from employee to entrepreneur, offering to lease me equipment at cost and referring clients whose cultural celebration needs exceeded her current capacity. Her generosity reflected not just business pragmatism but genuine friendship that had developed over 2 years of working together. She understood that my success would ultimately benefit both our businesses through referrals and collaboration rather than competition. The initial months of running my own business while caring for a toddler required organizational skills I hadn't known I possessed. Isabella spent mornings at a nearby daycare center run by Carmen's sister, allowing me to meet with clients and vendors during peak business hours. Afternoons were reserved for administrative work that I could manage while she napped or played in the office, creating a schedule that accommodated both her needs and my professional requirements. My first major independent client was the Hernandez family, who wanted to plan their daughter's wedding that would honor their Guatemalan heritage, while incorporating contemporary elements that reflected their daughter's life in Denver. The celebration required coordinating with specialty vendors in Guatemala for traditional textiles, finding musicians who could perform both traditional and modern music, and creating a menu that would satisfy 3 generations of family members, with varying dietary preferences and cultural expectations. The Hernandez wedding became a showcase for everything I'd learned about balancing authentic cultural traditions with practical American event planning. The ceremony incorporated Mayan spiritual elements that required consultation with cultural experts to ensure respectful representation. The reception featured traditional Guatemalan cuisine alongside contemporary dishes that would appeal to American guests, live marimba music during dinner, and a DJ for dancing that satisfied younger guests. The success of this wedding generated immediate referrals from guests who had never seen their own cultural traditions represented so thoughtfully at American celebrations. Within weeks, I was consulting with families planning quinceañeras, cultural anniversary celebrations, and fusion weddings that required expertise in traditions from across Latin America. Each event taught me something new about cultural nuances and family dynamics that couldn't be learned from books or formal training. The financial growth of the business allowed me to hire part-time help for childcare and administrative tasks, freeing me to focus on the creative and strategic aspects of event planning that generated the most revenue. Isabella thrived in her expanded social environment, learning Spanish from Carmen's family, and developing the kind of multicultural awareness that I hoped would serve her throughout life. My reputation in Denver's Latino community grew through word-of-mouth recommendations and social media posts featuring the celebrations I'd planned. Young couples who had struggled to find vendors who understood their cultural requirements were grateful to work with someone who could navigate both traditional expectations and contemporary preferences. Their enthusiasm and referrals created more business than I could handle alone. The decision to hire my first full-time employee came when I realized I was turning away potential clients due to scheduling conflicts. I needed someone who shared my cultural background and understood the importance of authentic representation, but who also brought complementary skills that would strengthen the business. After interviewing several candidates, I hired Lucia Morales, a recent graduate in hospitality management who spoke fluent Spanish and Portuguese, and had grown up helping plan celebrations in her extended Colombian family. Lucia's addition to the team allowed us to take on larger events and expand our services to include corporate cultural celebrations and community festivals. Her fresh perspective and formal education in event management complemented my practical experience and cultural knowledge, creating a partnership that enhanced both our capabilities. Together, we developed systems and processes that could scale the business while maintaining the personal attention that our clients valued. The first corporate contract we landed was with a Denver tech company that wanted to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month with an authentic cultural festival for their employees and families. The event required coordinating with multiple cultural organizations, managing a budget significantly larger than typical wedding planning, and creating educational components that would be engaging for diverse audiences including children and elderly family members. Planning this corporate festival pushed our skills into new areas of vendor management, logistics coordination, and cultural education that expanded what I understood about the event planning industry. We worked with mariachi bands, folklorico dance groups, traditional craft vendors, and authentic food trucks to create an experience that was both entertaining and educational. The success of this event led to similar contracts with other companies seeking to celebrate their diverse workforces authentically. As the business grew, I began receiving invitations to speak at industry conferences about multicultural event planning and the importance of authentic cultural representation in celebrations. These speaking opportunities positioned me as an expert in my field and generated business from other cities where planners needed consultation on cultural celebrations they weren't equipped to handle independently. The first time I was featured in a national wedding magazine, Isabella was 2 years old and had become the unofficial mascot of Celebraciones Emma, charming clients during office visits and appearing in behind-the-scenes photos on our social media accounts. The magazine article highlighted our approach to fusion weddings that honored multiple cultural traditions within single celebrations, showcasing our ability to navigate complex family dynamics and create events that satisfied diverse cultural expectations. This national exposure led to destination planning opportunities as couples from other states contacted me about coordinating cultural celebrations in Denver or providing consultation for events they were planning in their home cities. The geographic expansion of our client base required developing relationships with vendors across multiple states and learning about cultural traditions beyond my personal experience with Mexican and Central American celebrations. My personal life began evolving alongside my professional success as I met people through business networks who shared my interests and values. The isolation and loneliness that had characterized my first years in Denver gradually gave way to a social circle of entrepreneurs, cultural advocates, and professionals who understood the challenges and rewards of building something meaningful from nothing. David Clark entered my life as a client who was planning his sister's quinceañera and needed someone who could coordinate with vendors in Mexico for specialty items that weren't available in Denver. He was a successful architect who had moved to Denver from Los Angeles and was building his own firm specializing in sustainable residential design. Our initial business relationship developed into friendship as we discovered shared experiences of relocating to Denver to pursue professional opportunities and raise families according to our own values rather than external expectations. David was a single father to his 8-year-old son Marcus, having gained full custody after his ex-wife relocated to Europe for career opportunities. His experience navigating single parenthood while building a business created immediate common ground between us, and our children enjoyed each other's company during the family-friendly events we attended together. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than desperate need for partnership. The contrast between my relationship with David and my previous engagement to Ryan was striking in ways that illuminated how much I'd grown since leaving Atlanta. David appreciated my ambition and independence rather than seeing them as challenges to his masculinity. He encouraged my business expansion and celebrated my successes without needing to take credit for my achievements. Our partnership felt like collaboration between equals rather than one person trying to rescue or fix the other. Isabella's 3rd birthday party was held at our office space, which had been expanded to include a demonstration kitchen and cultural library that clients could use for planning inspiration. The celebration featured traditional Mexican games and decorations alongside contemporary elements that reflected our family's blend of cultural heritage and American lifestyle. David and Marcus attended alongside our extended chosen family of friends and colleagues, creating the kind of multicultural, multi-generational celebration that had become my specialty professionally and personally. The business had grown to employ 4 people full-time and generated enough revenue to support not just my family's needs, but also savings for Isabella's education and future business expansion. We were planning cultural celebrations across 3 states and had developed partnerships with cultural organizations, specialty vendors, and other event planners who referred clients needing our specific expertise. My relationship with Ryan had evolved into efficient co-parenting focused entirely on Isabella's well-being rather than any lingering romantic tension. He visited Denver quarterly for long weekends with his daughter, and their relationship was strong despite the geographic distance. His interactions with David were cordial and focused on coordinating schedules and sharing information about Isabella's development rather than competition or territorial behavior. Ryan's reports about Atlanta suggested that little had changed in his life beyond the addition of fatherhood responsibilities. He remained in the same job, living in the same apartment, navigating the same family dynamics that had made our relationship unsustainable. Linda Thompson continued her pattern of polite disinterest regarding Isabella, acknowledging her granddaughter's existence without expressing genuine investment in their relationship. The contrast between Linda's continued coldness and my Denver community's embrace of Isabella reinforced my decision to build our life where we were celebrated rather than tolerated. My daughter was growing up, trilingual, culturally aware, and confident in her identity as a Mexican-American child whose mother had built a successful business celebrating diverse traditions. She would never question her fundamental worth or accept treatment that diminished her dignity. The opportunity that would transform my business from local success to regional prominence came through a referral from one of my corporate clients. A major hotel chain was developing a new property in Denver that would specialize in cultural celebrations and destination weddings, and they needed a consultant to help design their event spaces and develop their cultural programming. The contract would be the largest single project I'd ever undertaken, with compensation that could fund significant business expansion. The hotel consultation required expertise in multiple cultural traditions, understanding of large-scale event logistics, and vision for creating flexible spaces that could accommodate diverse celebration styles. I worked with their architects and interior designers to create venues that could be transformed for Mexican quinceañeras, Colombian family reunions, Peruvian anniversary celebrations, and fusion weddings that incorporated multiple cultural traditions within single events. This project positioned me as a recognized expert in multicultural event design and led to similar consulting opportunities with other hospitality companies seeking to serve diverse clientele authentically. The consulting work was more lucrative than individual event planning and allowed me to influence how cultural celebrations were represented and supported across the industry. David and I had been dating for over a year when he proposed during a quiet evening at home, while Isabella and Marcus were building elaborate block castles in the living room. His proposal was characteristically thoughtful and practical, acknowledging that we were both established adults with children and businesses rather than young people planning idealistic futures. He wanted to build a life together that supported both our individual goals and our shared commitment to raising confident, culturally aware children. Our engagement was announced privately to friends and family, rather than through elaborate social media campaigns or magazine features. The response from my Denver community was overwhelmingly positive, as people who had watched me rebuild my life after arriving in Colorado with nothing but determination now celebrated this next chapter of happiness and partnership. The wedding planning process became an opportunity to showcase everything I'd learned about creating celebrations that honored multiple cultural traditions while reflecting contemporary values. David's Irish-American heritage would be incorporated alongside my Mexican background, and our children would play meaningful roles in the ceremony that acknowledged our commitment to building a blended family based on love and mutual respect. Planning my own wedding while running a successful event planning business provided unique insights into the industry from a client perspective that enhanced my ability to serve other couples facing similar decisions about cultural representation, family dynamics, and budget allocation. The experience reinforced my commitment to creating celebrations that reflected couples' authentic values rather than external expectations or industry trends. The wedding took place in the cultural center where I'd first attended prenatal classes, bringing my journey full circle from that terrified pregnant woman attending classes alone to a confident entrepreneur marrying her equal partner, while surrounded by chosen family who had supported every step of my transformation. Isabella served as our flower girl, while Marcus walked me down the aisle, symbolizing the family we were creating based on love and choice, rather than obligation or convenience. The celebration featured traditional Mexican elements, including mariachi music and authentic cuisine, alongside Irish traditions that honored David's heritage, creating the kind of fusion event that had become my specialty. The guest list included clients who had become friends, vendors who had become partners, and the community of entrepreneurs and advocates who had supported my business growth and personal development. The honeymoon was a working trip to Mexico, where David and I visited artisan workshops and cultural sites that would inspire future business projects, while also creating memories as a newly married couple. Isabella accompanied us, experiencing her cultural heritage firsthand, while David learned about traditions that would become part of our family's celebrations and my business's offerings. Returning from Mexico, I found that news of my wedding had generated media attention that positioned me as a successful example of single motherhood, entrepreneurship, and multicultural celebration expertise. The coverage led to speaking opportunities at national conferences and consulting requests from companies across the country seeking guidance on authentic cultural representation in their events and marketing. By Isabella's 4th birthday, Celebraciones Emma had become the premier multicultural event planning company in the Rocky Mountain region, with a reputation that extended nationally through media coverage and industry recognition. The business employed 8 people full-time and had generated enough success to purchase the building that housed our offices, providing both stability and investment value for our family's future. The transformation from the humiliated woman fleeing Atlanta to the successful entrepreneur and confident mother celebrating in Denver was complete in ways that vindicated every difficult decision I'd made along the journey. Linda Thompson's assessment of my inadequacy had been proven spectacularly wrong by achievements that belonged entirely to my vision and effort. My success wasn't just financial or professional, though both were significant accomplishments for someone who had arrived in Denver with $17 and no connections. The deeper transformation was personal, from someone who had sought validation from people determined not to give it to someone who created value through authentic work and meaningful relationships. Isabella was growing up in an environment where her mother's strength and determination were daily examples of what women could achieve when they refused to accept limitations imposed by others. She would never doubt her ability to create the life she wanted or question her worth based on other people's assessments. This was the most important legacy I could leave her, the knowledge that she possessed everything necessary to build a meaningful life on her own terms. The contrast between my current life and what would have been possible in Atlanta was stark enough to inspire gratitude, rather than regret. If Linda Thompson hadn't driven me away with her calculated cruelty, I would never have discovered my entrepreneurial capabilities or built a business that celebrated the cultural heritage I might have downplayed to fit into her family's expectations. David's support of my ambitions and celebration of my cultural identity created a partnership that enhanced both our lives rather than requiring either of us to diminish ourselves for the other's comfort. Our children were growing up in a household where diverse traditions were honored, where parents pursued meaningful work, and where love was demonstrated through respect and encouragement rather than control and criticism. The success of my business had positioned me to give back to the community that had supported my growth through mentoring other immigrant entrepreneurs and providing pro bono services for cultural organizations that couldn't afford professional event planning. These contributions felt like natural expressions of gratitude for the opportunities Denver had provided and the relationships that had sustained me through difficult transitions. Looking toward the future, I could envision expanding Celebraciones Emma into other markets, developing educational programs about cultural celebration traditions, and possibly writing about the intersection of entrepreneurship and multicultural identity. The foundation I'd built was strong enough to support ambitious goals while flexible enough to accommodate whatever opportunities emerged. The woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough or good enough for the Thompson family had built something that none of them could have imagined or achieved. Linda Thompson's rejection had freed me to become someone far more successful and fulfilled than I could have been while trying to earn her approval. Her cruelty had become the catalyst for my greatest achievements. The invitation arrived on elegant cardstock that immediately caught my attention among the usual business correspondence cluttering my desk at Celebraciones Emma. The return address showed Henderson and Associates, my former marketing agency in Atlanta, and the formal script announced their 25th anniversary celebration at the Grand Hyatt downtown. What made me pause wasn't nostalgia for my old job, but the realization that after 5 years of building my life in Denver, Atlanta was reaching back into my world in unexpected ways. Ashley Chen had included a personal note with the invitation, explaining that she'd been promoted to senior partner and specifically requested that I be included on the guest list. The celebration would honor notable alumni who had gone on to achieve success in their respective fields, and my name had been suggested as an example of entrepreneurial achievement that reflected well on the agency's training and culture. The irony wasn't lost on me that the job I'd left out of desperation was now claiming credit for my success. Isabella, now 5 years old and confidently bilingual, found me reading the invitation at our kitchen table while she practiced writing her name in both English and Spanish. She had inherited my determined personality along with David's architectural precision, approaching every task with focus that reminded me daily of how much she'd grown from the baby I'd carried when I fled Atlanta in humiliation and terror. David emerged from his home office, where he'd been reviewing blueprints for a sustainable housing development that had become his signature project in Denver. Our marriage had settled into comfortable routines that balanced individual professional demands with family priorities and shared household responsibilities. He approached challenges with the same methodical problem-solving skills that made him successful as an architect, and his steady support had become the foundation that allowed me to take calculated risks with business expansion. The Henderson and Associates celebration represented more than just a professional networking opportunity. Attending would mean returning to Atlanta for the first time since I'd driven away pregnant and heartbroken, facing people who had witnessed my humiliation and might still remember me as the woman who'd suffered a breakdown and abandoned her responsibilities. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and intriguing, like an opportunity to close a chapter I'd never properly finished. Marcus, now 13 and navigating middle school with typical teenage enthusiasm and drama, had become Isabella's protective older brother and David's trusted assistant with weekend construction projects. Our blended family had evolved into something stronger than traditional nuclear arrangements, built on choice and commitment rather than just biological connection. The children understood that love could create families just as effectively as genetics, and they'd grown up confident in their place within our deliberately constructed household. Ashley's follow-up phone call provided additional context that complicated my decision about attending the anniversary celebration. The event would include not just Henderson and Associates alumni, but also representatives from major Atlanta businesses and cultural organizations who had worked with the agency over the years. The guest list would likely include people from Ryan's construction industry, connections, and possibly even Linda Thompson, who remained active in Atlanta's charity circuit and social networks. The conversation with Ashley revealed how much my former colleague's life had changed since I'd left Atlanta. She'd married a fellow marketing professional, purchased a house in Virginia Highland near my old apartment, and was expecting her first child in the fall. Her excitement about pregnancy and early parenthood reminded me of my own naive optimism before Linda Thompson's calculated attack had shattered my confidence and forced me to question everything I'd believed about my readiness for adult responsibilities. Ashley's description of current Atlanta dynamics suggested that little had changed in the social and professional networks I'd abandoned. The same families dominated charity boards and cultural events. The same business relationships determined professional opportunities. And the same unspoken hierarchies governed who was accepted into inner circles of influence and status. My absence had apparently been absorbed without significant disruption to established patterns. Ryan's life had followed predictable trajectories, according to Ashley's carefully diplomatic updates. He'd received promotions within his construction management company, purchased a house in Buckhead near his parents' home, and was engaged to a woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales and had connections to Atlanta's established social networks. The engagement had been announced at his parents' country club with appropriate fanfare and family approval, suggesting that Linda Thompson had finally found a daughter-in-law who met her standards for compatibility and social positioning. The news of Ryan's engagement triggered unexpected emotions that had nothing to do with romantic regret, and everything to do with validation of decisions I'd made 5 years earlier. His choice of a conventional partner who fit seamlessly into his family's expectations confirmed that he'd never been capable of defending our relationship against his mother's objections. If he'd been willing to fight for us, he would have married me despite Linda's disapproval, but instead he'd waited until finding someone who required no defense. Isabella's reaction to hearing about her father's engagement was matter-of-fact acceptance that reflected her secure understanding of family structures that didn't conform to traditional models. She'd grown up knowing that parents could love children without being married to each other, that families could include step-siblings and chosen relatives, and that adult relationships were complex arrangements that sometimes changed over time. Her primary concern was whether Ryan's marriage would affect their quarterly visits and summer vacation arrangements. David's perspective on the Atlanta invitation was characteristically practical and supportive. He encouraged me to attend if I felt the experience would be professionally valuable or personally meaningful, while also acknowledging that returning to face people who had witnessed my lowest moments required courage that not everyone would understand or appreciate. His confidence in my ability to handle whatever emotional challenges might arise reflected his deep understanding of the strength I'd developed through building our life together. The decision to attend the Henderson and Associates celebration crystallized during a client meeting with a couple planning their wedding that would honor both Korean and Mexican traditions. As I guided them through decisions about cultural representation, family dynamics, and creating celebrations that reflected their authentic values rather than external expectations, I realized that my Atlanta experience had become foundational to everything I'd built in Denver. Facing that past from my current position of strength and success felt like completing a circle rather than opening old wounds. Maria Rodriguez, who had become both business mentor and chosen family member, offered to coordinate my Denver responsibilities during my Atlanta trip and provide backup support for any client emergencies that might arise. Her generosity reflected the network of professional and personal relationships I'd cultivated in Denver, where success was celebrated rather than undermined, and mutual support was genuine rather than conditional on maintaining hierarchical positions. The flight to Atlanta generated anxiety that surprised me with its intensity, despite 5 years of therapy, professional achievement, and personal growth that should have insulated me from old insecurities. As the plane descended through familiar Georgia humidity toward Hartsfield Airport, I realized that returning to the scene of my greatest humiliation required confronting not just other people's assessments of my worth, but also my own lingering doubts about whether I'd truly overcome the damage Linda Thompson had inflicted. Ashley met me at the airport with excitement that bridged the years since we'd worked together daily, and during the drive to my downtown hotel, she provided running commentary about Atlanta developments that had occurred during my absence. New restaurants had opened in neighborhoods where I'd once lived, construction projects had transformed skylines I remembered, and social dynamics had shifted in ways that reflected broader cultural changes, while maintaining essential character. The Grand Hyatt, where both the celebration and my accommodation were located, represented luxury that I could now afford comfortably rather than the aspirational spending that had characterized my Atlanta lifestyle. My room overlooked Peachtree Street, where I'd once walked to work each morning, and the view triggered memories of the woman I'd been before pregnancy, betrayal, and forced independence had transformed me into someone I couldn't have imagined becoming. The evening of the Henderson and Associates celebration, I chose an outfit that reflected my current success, without appearing to try too hard to impress people whose opinions no longer mattered to my self-worth. The dress was elegant but understated, professionally appropriate while showcasing confidence earned through genuine achievement, rather than borrowed from someone else's status or approval. My jewelry included pieces David had given me that represented our partnership and cultural heritage items that connected me to traditions I'd learned to celebrate rather than hide. The hotel ballroom buzzed with conversations between people whose faces triggered immediate recognition despite years of separation. Former colleagues had aged and achieved various levels of professional advancement, while clients and industry connections maintained the polished appearance and social fluidity that characterized Atlanta's business community. The energy felt familiar yet distant, like visiting a museum dedicated to a life I'd once lived but could barely remember inhabiting. Ashley introduced me to current agency partners and notable guests with obvious pride in my entrepreneurial success. Describing Celebraciones Emma's growth and national recognition, in ways that positioned me as an example of the agency's positive influence on alumni careers. The conversations were professionally engaging and personally gratifying, confirming that my achievements were substantial enough to command respect from people whose approval I'd once desperately sought. The recognition came gradually as people remembered my face and connected it to stories they'd heard about my abrupt departure from Atlanta years earlier. Some conversations included carefully diplomatic inquiries about my transition to Denver and current family situation, while others focused exclusively on business topics that avoided personal territory entirely. The range of responses reflected the various narratives that had circulated about my leaving, from mental health breakdown to career opportunity to family crisis. I spotted Linda Thompson before she noticed me, recognizing her elegant posture and precisely styled appearance from across the crowded ballroom. She was holding court with several women I remembered from charity board circles, gesturing expressively while describing what appeared to be a successful fundraising campaign. Her confidence and social positioning seemed unchanged, as though the 5 years since I'd left Atlanta had passed without affecting her fundamental role within established hierarchies. Ryan appeared at Linda's side looking older but essentially unchanged, wearing the kind of conservative suit that suggested continued employment in traditional corporate environments. His fiancée was exactly what I would have predicted: blonde, polished, conventionally pretty in ways that would photograph well at charity events and country club gatherings. She wore the kind of engagement ring that announced serious family money and social connections, and her interactions with Linda suggested comfortable acceptance rather than the tension that had characterized my relationship with Ryan's mother. The moment Linda Thompson recognized me was visible from across the room as her social smile froze momentarily before recovering with practiced grace. Our eyes met briefly before she turned her attention back to her conversation partners, but the recognition had occurred and the evening's dynamics had shifted in ways that both of us understood. The woman she'd humiliated at a baby shower 5 years earlier was now present as an honored guest at a professional celebration, successful enough to warrant invitation and confident enough to attend. Ashley noticed the tension and moved to intercept any potential awkwardness by guiding our conversation group toward the opposite side of the ballroom, but I felt ready to face whatever interaction might develop naturally. My presence at this celebration wasn't about confronting Linda Thompson or seeking vindication for past cruelties, but about demonstrating to myself that I could occupy space in Atlanta without shame or fear of inadequacy. The formal program included speeches from agency founders about their company's evolution and alumni achievements, with specific recognition for notable successes that reflected well on Henderson and Associates' training and culture. When my name was mentioned among entrepreneurs who had built significant businesses after leaving the agency, scattered applause acknowledged accomplishments that belonged entirely to my vision and effort, rather than any foundation the agency had provided. During the cocktail reception that followed the formal presentations, Linda Thompson approached with calculated timing that suggested she'd been waiting for the right moment to initiate contact. Her greeting was superficially warm but carried undertones of assessment and judgment that reminded me immediately of conversations we'd had during my engagement to Ryan. She complimented my apparent success while simultaneously implying surprise that I'd achieved professional recognition. Our conversation was a masterclass in polite hostility disguised as social pleasantries. Linda inquired about my business with the kind of detailed questions that suggested she'd researched Celebraciones Emma before the event, probably expecting to find exaggerated claims or modest achievement that wouldn't match my current presentation. When I described our growth, client base, and industry recognition with matter-of-fact confidence, her expression shifted slightly as she realized my success was substantial and well-documented. She mentioned Isabella with careful neutrality, acknowledging her granddaughter's existence without expressing genuine interest in her development or well-being. The conversation revealed that Ryan had shared minimal information about his daughter's life in Denver, probably to avoid triggering Linda's disapproval about my parenting choices or lifestyle decisions. Her questions about Isabella's education and cultural upbringing carried subtle criticisms about raising children away from family support and traditional influences. Ryan joined our conversation with obvious discomfort, introducing his fiancée Sarah with nervous energy that suggested he'd been dreading this interaction throughout the evening. Sarah was polite but distant, clearly aware of our history, and uncertain about appropriate responses to meeting her fiancé's ex and the mother of his child. Her discomfort was understandable given the awkward social dynamics, But it also revealed that Ryan had probably shared Linda's version of our relationship, rather than complete information about why I had left Atlanta. The conversation continued with forced civility, as we exchanged updates about our respective lives, with the kind of surface-level pleasantries that avoided acknowledging the real dynamics between us. Linda described Ryan's recent promotion and engagement as though they were family achievements that reflected well on her guidance and judgment. Sarah contributed appropriately timed comments that suggested she'd been coached about navigating this interaction without causing offense or revealing too much about their relationship. When Linda mentioned that they'd missed having Isabella at family gatherings and hoped future visits might include extended stays in Atlanta, I recognized the familiar pattern of manipulation disguised as concern. She was attempting to plant seeds of doubt about my decision to raise Isabella in Denver, while simultaneously suggesting that they were entitled to more involvement in her upbringing than geographic distance allowed. My response was diplomatically firm, explaining that Isabella was thriving in Denver's multicultural environment and benefiting from exposure to diverse traditions and languages that were expanding her cultural awareness. I described her bilingual development, her comfort with different celebration styles, and her confidence in navigating various social environments as advantages that wouldn't be available in more homogeneous settings. The implication was clear. My parenting choices were producing positive results that spoke for themselves. The conversation revealed how little Linda's fundamental perspective had changed, despite years of evidence that her assessment of my capabilities had been incorrect. She continued to view my success as surprising rather than predictable, temporary rather than sustainable, and somehow less legitimate than achievements that came through traditional pathways of family connection and social approval. Her inability to acknowledge that she'd been wrong about me reflected the kind of rigid thinking that had made our relationship impossible from the beginning. Ryan's contributions to the conversation suggested that he'd never fully understood why I'd left Atlanta, or what I'd been trying to achieve by starting over in Denver. He seemed genuinely surprised by the scope of my business success and the confidence with which I described our life in Colorado. His questions about my work revealed that he'd maintained mental image of me as the struggling young woman who'd needed his family's help rather than the entrepreneur who'd built something significant through her own efforts. The most telling moment came when Linda asked about my support system in Denver, clearly expecting to hear about financial struggles or social isolation that would validate her concerns about my decision to leave Atlanta. When I described David and our blended family, my network of professional colleagues and chosen family relationships, and Isabella's integration into Denver's multicultural community, Linda's expression revealed disappointment that I hadn't suffered the consequences she'd probably expected. Sarah's questions about multicultural event planning suggested genuine interest in my work that contrasted with Linda's barely concealed skepticism. Her engagement with the topic revealed intelligence and curiosity that made me wonder whether she truly understood what she was marrying into, or whether she'd simply accepted Linda's version of family dynamics without questioning the underlying assumptions. Her politeness toward me seemed genuine rather than performative, suggesting that she might be capable of independent judgment if she chose to exercise it. The conversation concluded when other guests approached our group, providing natural opportunities for us to separate and continue enjoying the evening independently. Linda's parting comments about hoping we could stay in better touch felt obligatory rather than sincere, and Ryan's suggestion that we schedule a longer conversation about Isabella's upcoming summer visit was practical rather than emotional. The interaction had achieved its purpose of demonstrating that we could occupy the same social space without drama or unresolved conflict. The remainder of the evening passed with conversations that focused on business topics and professional developments rather than personal history. Former colleagues were genuinely interested in my entrepreneurial journey and asked thoughtful questions about building a business from scratch in a new city. Their respect for my achievements felt authentic and reflected recognition that leaving Henderson and Associates had led to something more significant than what I could have accomplished by remaining in traditional employment. During the drive back to my hotel, Ashley provided her perspective on the evening's dynamics with the kind of honest assessment that characterized our friendship. She'd observed my interaction with Linda Thompson and Ryan with interest, noting how much my presence and confidence had seemed to surprise them. Her comment that I seemed like a completely different person from the woman who'd left Atlanta 5 years earlier felt like recognition of transformation that extended beyond professional success to fundamental changes in how I understood my own worth. The flight back to Denver the next morning provided time to process the experience of returning to Atlanta from a position of strength rather than desperation. The anxiety that had characterized my departure was replaced by satisfaction that I'd faced my past without shame or apology, demonstrated my success without arrogance or defensiveness, and maintained dignity throughout interactions that could have become emotionally charged. The experience felt like completion, rather than reopening of old wounds. Isabella's excitement about my return and her questions about Atlanta revealed her secure understanding that her mother's past didn't threaten her current happiness or future opportunities. She was curious about the city where she'd been conceived and where her father still lived, but her primary interest was in showing me the art project she'd completed during my absence, and the new Spanish phrases she'd learned from Carmen's grandmother during their weekend visit. David's welcoming embrace and genuine interest in my experience reflected the kind of partnership that made challenging situations manageable, rather than overwhelming. His questions about the trip focused on my emotional reactions and professional insights, rather than comparisons with past relationships or concerns about unresolved feelings. His confidence in our relationship and respect for my autonomy allowed me to process the Atlanta experience without feeling defensive or pressured to minimize its significance. The Henderson and Associates celebration had provided unexpected validation that my decision to leave Atlanta had been correct, in ways that extended beyond just escaping Linda Thompson's hostility. The professional and personal life I'd built in Denver was more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have achieved by remaining in Georgia trying to earn acceptance from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. My success belonged entirely to my vision and effort, rather than inherited advantages or family connections. The contrast between Linda Thompson's continued skepticism about my capabilities and the genuine respect I'd earned from former colleagues highlighted how much my understanding of worthiness and achievement had evolved since leaving Atlanta. I no longer needed external validation to confirm my value, but I appreciated recognition from people whose professional judgment I respected. The difference was that approval had become affirmation rather than necessity. Ryan's surprise about my success and confidence revealed that he'd never truly understood my potential or the limitations that his family's dynamics had imposed on our relationship. His choice of a conventional partner who fit seamlessly into established expectations confirmed that he'd been looking for someone to fill a predetermined role rather than a genuine partner who would challenge and inspire growth. Sarah seemed nice enough, but their relationship appeared to be based on compatibility, rather than the kind of transformative love that had characterized my marriage to David. The experience of returning to Atlanta had completed a psychological circle that allowed me to fully appreciate the life I'd built in Denver, without lingering doubts about paths not taken or opportunities abandoned. Linda Thompson's assessment of my inadequacy had been proven spectacularly wrong by achievements that she could never have imagined when she delivered her calculated attack at my baby shower 5 years earlier. Isabella's thriving development as a confident, culturally aware child who spoke multiple languages and navigated diverse social environments with ease represented the most profound vindication of my parenting choices. She was growing up knowing that families could be created through choice and commitment, that traditions could be honored while embracing innovation, and that success came through authentic effort rather than inherited privilege or social positioning. The business continued growing beyond my most optimistic projections, with opportunities emerging across multiple states and client bases that appreciated authentic cultural representation rather than stereotypical appropriation. The consulting work had evolved into speaking engagements and educational programs that positioned me as an expert in multicultural celebration design and cross-cultural business development. David's architectural practice had achieved similar recognition for sustainable design that honored environmental and cultural considerations simultaneously. Our professional lives complemented each other while remaining independent, creating the kind of partnership that enhanced both our individual achievements and our shared family priorities. We were building something together that belonged to both of us equally rather than one person supporting the other's dreams. The anniversary celebration in Atlanta had reminded me how much my life had changed and how grateful I was for Linda Thompson's unwitting gift of freedom. Her cruelty had forced me to discover capabilities I hadn't known I possessed and create relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Her rejection had launched me toward a life that was infinitely more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have built while trying to earn her approval. Looking toward the future, I could envision continued business expansion, deeper community involvement, and the possibility of additional children who would grow up in our deliberately inclusive household. The foundation David and I had built was strong enough to support ambitious dreams, while flexible enough to accommodate whatever opportunities or challenges might emerge. The woman who had been humiliated at her baby shower for being inadequate and unprepared had built a life that exceeded every measure of success that Linda Thompson could have imagined. Her assessment of my capabilities had been proven wrong by achievements that belonged entirely to my vision, effort, and refusal to accept limitations imposed by people who didn't understand my potential. Isabella would grow up knowing that she possessed everything necessary to create the life she wanted, regardless of other people's expectations or approval. This was the most important legacy I could leave her. The knowledge that authentic success came through honoring your values rather than accepting roles that others assigned to you. The journey from that devastating afternoon in the Atlanta community center to this moment of quiet satisfaction in our Denver home had taught me that sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is their rejection. Linda Thompson's cruelty had freed me to become someone far better than I could have been while seeking her acceptance. Her attempt to diminish me had instead launched me toward achievements that made her original assessment irrelevant. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. Every success I achieved, every client I served, every cultural tradition I helped celebrate was proof that Linda Thompson had been spectacularly wrong about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Her granddaughter was growing up in a household where strength was demonstrated through authenticity rather than dominance, where success was measured by contribution rather than control, and where love was expressed through respect rather than manipulation. This was my response to her attempt to destroy my confidence and derail my future, a life so fulfilling and authentic that her opinion had become completely irrelevant. She'd wanted to prove that I wasn't good enough for her family, and instead, she'd freed me to discover that her family wasn't good enough for me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.